I was there the night Carolina burned. The master's mansion, once white as bone, glowed red against the dark sky. People whispered that his experiments had finally come alive. I saw shadows moving in the fire, too many to count, screaming, clawing to escape. What he created in that house was never meant to live, and when it did, it destroyed everything: his name, his family, even the land itself. That night, Carolina died. I was a child when the master first came to our fields. He arrived with a ledger under one arm and a strange light in his eyes. A man who measured men the way others measured land. His name was Crowe. He called it Crowe's Hollow Plantation. 1,100 acres of red soil, black river, and corn that whispered at night. The master wore fine coats and kept a mistress who never smiled. The overseer wore iron on his hands and a whip behind his back. They brought chains and names and a roster we could not escape. We were not a single thing. We were families, work songs, broken hands mending fences, and a dozen small rebellions kept quiet beneath cotton and sweat. I remember the church they let us have, a crooked wooden thing where we dared to pray. I remember Christmas feasts where the masters laughed and fed themselves on roasted meat while we took scraps and hid our hunger. The plantation had a calendar of cruelty. Feast days when slaves were paraded for sport. Nights when men were hanged from an oak as warning. Yet in the dark corners of the fields there were hushes and warm hands and the quick, stubborn joy of those who would not be broken. And there was his daughter. The mistress hid her in a glassed room, and the master called her Lydia, like property stamped on a ledger. She never walked the fields. She walked the house that smelled of wax and old linens. She could not see. She was blind. But she laughed sometimes, a small bright thing that made the cook stop stirring the pot and listen. The master loved her in a way that had no name in any hymn, with a hunger for control that spread like rot. He treated her like a problem to be solved, a ledger entry to balance. What he wanted to fix with coin and book and strange devices, none of us could imagine. Yet everyone on Crowe's Hollow felt the change in the air. A machine's hum came like thunder, and the overseer's orders became sharper. What he did next would tear the old rules apart. What he did next would change everything. Lydia's world was sound and touch and the echo of voices. She would run her fingers along carved banisters and call a servant by name, and the voices would answer like birds. She loved the river's hush and the smell of rain on tar. Small things we took for granted until we watched them through her hands. The master would sit at the foot of her bed and read about doctors who could stitch sight back into the blind, texts that smelled of decay and ambition. He would whisper to her about light, as if it were a treasure hidden in the ribs of the earth. He built a room filled with glass and wires and jars that caught the light. He said it was for her. He named professors he had never met, sent letters that smelled of foreign ports. The mistress folded her hands and pretended to be proud while her eyes slid sideways like a bird's. The overseer kept closer patrols. The cook began to whisper about late-night sounds, the clack of metal, the muffled moan of something experimented on. The master's ledger filled with new expenses: lamps, metal clamps, bitter tinctures, and one crude iron rack. People began to disappear from the rows for a night and come back pale and smaller. We told ourselves it was medicine. We told ourselves anything to sleep. Lydia would sit at the window and sing to the fields in a voice that made the old men blush. She would touch my face and call me friend, and hold my hand as if I were a map she trusted. I watched her at the edge of the sound of the experiments and felt a new weight, one that picked at the edges of courage and fear. The master told himself he would give her sight, a kind of miracle to wash the plantation clean. But miracles can be knives. What he thought to solve with light would summon something darker. And when his experiments touched the skin of the enslaved, the ledger's sums did not include what would be bought in blood. And then the nights changed. What had been small and human became a clockwork of secrecy. We learned to weigh the clicks of the master's boots and count the beat of the overseer's cane. None of us could know what waited in the jars. Only that something in that room stirred at night like a thing trying to remember itself. Something was being made. They called it practice. The master called the men and women who were taken subjects, as though a ledger could rename a soul. The doctor the master hired smelled of laudanum and old sea salt. He had papers with diagrams and words that made the mistress shiver. He hooked instruments to the skin like dark prayer beads and dropped cold metal to the brow. They took 11 in the autumn, 11 who worked the river and the orchard, and the master's ledger listed them as enrolled. We watched them go, their eyes full of questions that we could not answer. The cook stopped singing. The children were told the adults were on a long errand. They brought Lydia into the room for the first time when the moon was new. She reached for the doctor, her hands trembling, and the doctor pretended gentleness. He spoke of light and lengths, and the master's fingers were like iron around a ledger. That night the tests began. Tinctures dropped into mouths, cold steel on wrists, sparks that smelled of copper and singed hair. The overseer kept a rope by the door and a list in his pocket. We watched in the dark and told stories loud enough to drown out the noises we could not bear. Pain came not as a story, but as a long, slow accounting of loss. People lost sleep, lost their songs, lost their names in whisperings. Some were returned to their work with a silence that made them thinner, as if something had taken their center. Others learned a new fear of the doctor's pens. The master wrote the results in his ledger with a neat hand, as if illness could be sorted like tobacco. He said it was for Lydia, for love. The mistress said, perhaps, it was for power. The overseer said nothing because his job was not to ask. At night the plantation animals grew skittish. Dogs refused to pass the master's gate. Chickens clucked and hid. The river seemed to carry something downriver on its black back, a smell like a closed house. People began to dream of a child crying beneath the floorboards. They dreamed of a shape that moved behind glass. We were making something in the dark, and no hymn could save us from the rhythm of that making. The master believed himself a bringer of light. The doctor believed in diagrams. The overseer believed in the lash. But none of their faith could tell them what would happen when human flesh and obsession were mixed like chemicals. What grew from that mixing would not obey a ledger. It learned. They called it a child in the beginning, half as a hope and half to soften the ledger's edge. But I cannot call a child the way I say my own name. It was something stitched from breath and bitterness, from the master's longing and the doctor's cold instruments. It came in the blue hour between night and dawn, in a room filled with the stink of boiled herbs and the master's shaking hands. Lydia was there, whispering lullabies she had been taught by the cook, and the world tilted. When it was born, it did not cry like the babies I have known. It made a sound like glass grinding on glass, a sound that lingered in the bones. Its skin was pale and stretched. Its fingers curled as if holding a memory no one could read. It had an odor like old rain. The master wept in a way that would make any ledger tremble. The doctor scribbled as if notes would fix the thing that had been made. The overseer simply stood and watched, the iron at his side fast and heavy. We tried to name it many things: miracle, abomination, answer, curse. The mistress hid her face. The 11 watched from the corner like a slow eclipse. Lydia touched it with a tenderness that broke me, calling it my light, and reaching as if she could give it a map. I do not know whether it felt love. I only know that when it moved its mouth, the windows trembled, the dogs howled, the candles shivered. The creation learned to listen to the master's heartbeat and the overseer's sleep. It learned the taste of fear, the texture of chain. Some nights it followed the cook and mimicked the way she stirred the pot. Some nights it sat on the steps and listened to the children's games, and the children grew still, as if the world had tilted and could not find its axis. People who came onto the land later would call it the thing, or the hollow child. But where the ledger returned to numbers, a wound had opened. The master saw himself both as maker and father, and the two ideas warred until his mind frayed. Strangers began to whisper that the child's eyes reflected something like light, but not of this world, a glassy hollow that could steal a song. Once, when the wind hit the shutters just so, I swear the child smiled, and the ash on the fireplace drifted upward like a drowned thing trying to breathe. It did not grow like a child. It shaped itself like a rumor, small at first, then widening into everything. And it taught us how fragile the line between man and thing could be. What we had made would not remain caged by glass. It wanted the field and the river and the night. And by wanting, it became dangerous in ways none of us had accounted for. After the child came, nights were not for sleep. The fields hummed. Tools went missing. The overseer's lanterns blew out. Horses bolted as if seeing something in the dark. The 11 who had been made into subjects now moved like men with a quiet plan under their ribs. They no longer sang the old songs in the same way. Their voices were lower, stitches in a cloak of new thought. We met in the cellar beneath the cookhouse where the master's rats dared not go and whispered of escape and of a punishment the ledger had never listed. We had learned the secret paths of the land, the old Indian trails, the buried hollows. We had learned how to unhook shackles with a careful twist. We had learned how to hide in the reed beds when the overseer came to count the rows. The master had not counted on the shape of our anger, small at first, and then precise like a flint. We spoke in short sentences. The youngest of the 11, a man named Samuel, had a face like a stone and a mind like a fire. He said, "They will not stop." And when he said it, the room went colder. That same week strange things began to happen at the mansion. The child would appear in doorways where no one had placed it, or the master would awaken with soot on his lips and scalding water stolen from the kitchen. The overseer found his whip knotted and useless. Dogs died with their mouths full of feathers. On the night of the master's birthday feast, the candles guttered and a smell of iron filled the halls. The mistress wept in a closet, and something scratched at the glass. We watched from outside as if the house were a stage lit for a play we were too frightened to join. The 11 made a plan not merely to run, but to end the ledger of cruelty there and then. They would not only free themselves, they would end the thing that allowed the master to play God upon flesh. It was not an act of blind fury. It was a resolution shaped like a blade. We would take the child away from the master's hands, or we would take the master away from the child. We spoke of slipping into the glass room and seizing the child, of burning the ledger, of standing at the gate and hurling the master's papers into the river. The plan tasted of smoke and iron and the sweetness of a life imagined without chains. But plans have edges. On the night of the new moon, when shadows swallow names, the child cried not like glass, but like a bell, a sound that drew men and the master to the window. Something in the house moved like an animal waking. What was inside the master's obsession had learned its way into the night and would not be kept silent. We were ready to strike. What we could not know was how the plantation itself had decided to answer. It was on a night so dark the stars seemed to have been burned out that we moved. Samuel led the 11 like a handful of lightning. We crept through the rows, the soft rustle of our clothes like prayer. The cook had bribed a stable boy with a bowl of stew to keep the gate unlatched. We carried no torches, only small knives wrapped in cloth and the blackness itself for cover. The house loomed like a beast with a mouth of windows. The child's sound, a thin ringing, threaded through the rooms. We slipped into the glass room. The panes were cold under our palms. There the child sat in the center, not bound but watched with a hunger by the master. His face was a map of a man who had not slept for years. The doctor stood behind him, a pen in his hand and wax on his cuffs. Lydia reached for the child and called it light, as if the word could heal the hunger of what had been made. For a fraction of a second everything paused, the world inhaled. Then an ember caught. A candle knocked by a thrown chair, a saucer of oil, a spark that needed only one tiny hand to become a river. The master screamed and the overseer took a step, leather creaking. The smoke came first, a thick animal that drowned the glass. Chains at the doorway began to strain as if men were pulling at fate itself. Someone shouted, and we moved like wolves. The fire licked the curtains and then the drapes, and the house took on a heart of red. The child's sound turned into a keening that hung on the rafters. The overseer ran to the stair and a rope came down. Men were bound and the ladder was pulled. The master ran like a man who realized too late that property may be counted, but not salvation. We were not angels. We had knives and a grief that sharpened our hands. Samuel moved toward the master. Our hands found the leather of the ledger and ripped it free, pages scattering like moths. The doctor tried to flee but tripped and his pen skittered across the floor. The mistress fell to her knees and called for mercy that would not come. At the front gate, the horses bolted. On the field, the dogs howled. The river took the sound of the house and pushed it downstream like a warning. The child, the thing, slipped from Lydia's hands. It ran into the smoke and did not look back. I saw it cross the yard like a rumor and then vanish into the dark tree line as if swallowed by the earth itself. The master tried to follow, but the flames closed like a fist. He screamed. The overseer tried to drag him free, but the ropes were already burning. Men with iron faces came from the stables to help, but the fire took the roof and the beams and something gave way with a sound like 1,000 chains snapping at once. When the last of the master's screams was swallowed by the wind, the house rolled inward, and the moon watched like a witness who could not speak. The plantation shook as if awakening from a nightmare. We fled into the reeds, breath raw and hands blistered. We had not planned for the scale of what would come after. We had not planned for the way ash would cling to hair and the way the river would carry pieces of the ledger downstream to a town that would tell the tale in a dozen different ways. The master was dead. The overseer was gone. The mistress had burned her hands to the bone trying to pry open a window. The child was not found in the rubble, and some said it had fled into the woods or to the river, or that it had crawled into a hollow and become the first ghost of that place. The 11 escaped that night into the dark, singing nothing, hiding everything. But running did not end the ledger. We had set loose a weight upon the land that would not easily be shrugged off. What happened next would be whispered for generations. We scattered like ash on the wind. Some of us fled north and wore new names. Some walked to neighboring counties and married and buried their pasts under new grasses. The 11 were seen in odd places later, a pair of hands at a mill, a shadow at a church window, a man who walked the docks and would not speak of the fire. Lydia vanished from the public record. Some say she walked into the sea, others that she left the country in a carriage paid for by guilt. The mistress came back once to the ruins with a shawl and a prayer, and the ruins spat her away as if they had learned the art of refusing. Stories grew like mold. People in the nearest town began to tell different versions of the same truth. Some said the creation had been killed and buried beneath the ash. Some said it grew into a thing that haunted the river and would call to lone travelers at night. Priests went through the fields with crosses and confident words, but even their voices thinned when they passed the glass room's foundation. Children dared one another to touch the charred stones and felt the static on their skin that smelled of old rain. The land would not be the same. Crops failed where they had once been lush. Horses refused to graze by the east wall. Nature learned the name of our fear and kept repeating it in small, subtle ways. I wandered for a long while, my hands empty, my heart full of a sound I could not unlearn. I found work on a riverboat and later at a blacksmith's, but Crowe's Hollow was a pull like a dark moon. I returned years later to see the skeleton of the house, a black mouth picking at the sky. People who had once laughed over the master's feasts now told the tale in halting voices. They say the child still sings, an old woman told me on a porch, and the sound of her own words seemed to tremble. I pressed my palm to the stones where the glass room had stood and felt cold that had nothing to do with weather. The ledger was gone, or at least the pages had been scattered downstream and read in strange hands. What the master had done was not simply cruelty. It was an attempt to buy back what grief had taken. He thought to trade coin and cleverness for a life he believed should have been his to mend. The result was a wound that bled into the land and into the people who touched it. We had burned a house to end the ledger, but fire does not erase memory. Memory buries itself in songs, in scars, in the names of rivers, and in the way children look at an old foundation that still smells faintly of smoke. People come now to Crowe's Hollow with lamps and cameras, hunting for a story to tell on a screen. They take one picture of the charred gate and call it content. But there is more between the stones than a single image can hold. There are the echoes of a child's glass voice and the soft, patient footfalls of those who were forced to be lessons in a madman's book. If you stand at the river at night and listen, you might hear a lullaby braided with the wind, and it will make your teeth ache with longing. You might hear a whisper asking for the ledger to be closed for good. I tell you this now because I am counted among the things that did not leave. I am the voice that touches the edge of your sleep, the memory that will not let the land rest. I am the ash that will settle into your shoes if you walk too close. They call it a curse, or a tragedy, or a legend. I call it living proof of what happens when obsession believes itself above mercy. The master wanted light. He birthed a shadow. He paid the price for his own ledger, and the fields paid the rest. If you ever pass by a place where a house burned, and the trees whisper in a voice you do not know, remember that some experiments do not end in discovery. They end in ruin. Remember the names we were given and the ones we chose. Remember the 11, and Lydia, and the master with his neat ledger and empty hands. And if you hear the thin sound of glass singing under the moon, do not be surprised, for that night, what was born in Crowe's hollow found its voice, and it has not stopped speaking since. It is still listening, and sometimes it answers. They say nothing grows where the house once stood, not corn, not ivy, not even weeds. The soil is blackened, as if it remembers the fire that swallowed its master whole. Travelers avoid the road after dusk. Horses shy and tremble near the bend, their breath fogging the air, as if they see someone we cannot. Locals whisper of a woman's voice calling from the trees, soft and trembling, like wind through broken glass. They say she speaks a name that no one dares repeat. I came back once. Years later, the river had changed its course, the church long collapsed, and the stones of the old slave quarters buried under moss. But when I stood where the laboratory had been, I swore the air was alive. A hum, faint and restless, like breath pressed against my ear. The kind of sound that knows your name before you speak it. Some say what the master created was never meant to die, that it lives between the cracks of time, waiting to be seen again. Others say it was justice, wearing the faces of those who suffered, finally given form. I do not argue with them anymore. Because every night, when the wind slides through my window and the glass begins to tremble, I feel it. Watching, remembering, counting every name. And somewhere in the dark, it breathes again, what was born in Crowe's hollow. It is still listening, and now it remembers you.